Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're watching this, sixth grade music classes. So, this week we're going to start watching The Phantom of the Opera. And I'm going to get you started today with a little bit of background, the same stuff we would do in class. And then probably Wednesday or Thursday this week, I'll be sending out the first clip of it. We're going to watch it kind of like we would in class in 30 to 40-minute blocks. And I can pause it and talk about different things that are happening in it because it's a pretty complex story and a little bit hard to understand what's going on in some sections. And there are some significant parts that I want you to be aware of. So we'll do that a little later this week. Today, I want to give you some background on the Phantom himself, some of the legends and stories that went along with it, a look at the Paris Opera House so you understand some of the stuff that led to the stories of the Phantom of the Opera and why it's so complex. And we'll also talk about some of the different characters so as you're watching it, you have a little better understanding of it. So, the story of the Phantom of the Opera is partly based on true things that happened at the Paris Opera House. We'll look at the Paris Opera House in a few minutes, but the idea behind the Phantom of the Opera is that there is this person, this phantom, who lives in the opera house, and he has fallen in love with this young singer, and he has been teaching her through the walls of the opera house. She thinks that her father died when she was only 7 years old, and the last thing that her father said to her was that he would send an angel to teach her how to sing better. And so the Phantom speaks to Christine, this young girl, through the walls. She never sees him. She doesn't know he's a real person on the other side of the walls. And so she thinks that it's this angel that her father sent to teach her to sing better. And he trains her to be a fantastic singer. Um, he wants her to be the star of the opera house. And the opera house is run by a couple of gentlemen, Andre and Fearman. You'll learn about them as the movie goes on. And the star of the opera is a woman named Carlotta, who is a terrible singer, but she is allowed to be the star because her family is very wealthy. And if she's not allowed to be the star, she will leave and her family will pull all their money from the opera house and the opera house will end up closing. So they're threatened by Carlotta. So even though she's terrible, she's allowed to sing. And the Phantom's goal is to get rid of Carlotta and have Christine be the lead, the main singer, and become the star of the opera house. Raoul is a childhood friend of Christine's who comes back as a wealthy patron, someone who gives money to the opera house. And Christine realizes that she is still in love with him, and Raoul realizes that he is in love with her. And so we have what's called this love triangle, where Raoul and the Phantom are both in love with Christine, and she has to make a choice between the two of them. And I don't want to give too much more away about the end of the movie. We'll get to that as we go along. So the story of the Phantom of the Opera is based partly in fact. There was an accident in the opera house where the chandelier did fall, and it did kill a worker when it fell. But it was not dropped by the Phantom of the Opera, and it did not drop on an audience during a performance like Gaston Leroux. So he took the truth of the chandelier falling and kind of made the story more interesting by adding some other things to it, saying that the Phantom dropped the chandelier and it killed a lot of people when it fell. But it is based partly in truth. There were stories of ghosts in the opera house for years and years and years. People would hear strange noises. Part of that was due to the fact that the walls were open and empty throughout the entire opera house, so people would hear noises coming from everywhere else in the opera house. And there was also a manager of the opera house who did have a young child who had a facial deformity. And during that time period, it was not unusual for families to give away their children to the circus if there was something wrong with them, if they were too short or they had something wrong with them. The circus was a place where you would see people like the bearded lady and the rubber-faced man. And so this young boy had something wrong with one whole side of his face. And so his father would hide him in the walls of the opera house. And of course, babies cry. And so people would hear crying through the walls of the opera house and these wailing sounds. And so that helped fuel the stories of the ghosts in the opera house that lived in the walls. And it also helped with the story of this young boy who had a facial deformity that the story of the Phantom is based on. So part of it is true in terms of where the story comes from. And then Gaston Leroux just added all of his own twists to it to help the story come along. It takes a while to get going. There's a lot of characters involved that you'll have to learn about as the movie goes on. But today we're going to look at the Opera House, so I'm going to switch a few things around here and put some stuff up on the screen and talk over them so you can see how everything is put together. So for now, I want you to watch this video, and then in a couple of days I'll put up the first clip of the actual Phantom of the Opera, and then we'll have an opportunity in Schoology to do some discussion, and you can ask some questions, and we'll go from there, okay? So keep watching. Okay, so I'm just going to capture my screen so you can watch along with this. So this is a view of the Paris Opera House. It was a very, very large building. It still is a very large building today, still exists, just like it was back in the 1870s. This huge skylight dome over the front of the building, and then these incredible gargoyles, which you'll see are an important part of the story a little bit later on. Here's another picture of the front of the opera house, and then going in this main door here right at the center in the front would take you into what was known as the grand staircase, and the staircase would take you up to the performance level, and then through these doors was an entrance into the hallway that would lead. This is the beautiful grand hallway, just incredible architecture, beautiful paintings. Everything was covered in gold leaf foil. It was truly an amazing, still is again today, truly an amazing building. This is inside the actual performance hall. These are the balconies. The main seating is down here at the bottom, and then the stage and the main curtain, and then these are the box seats. These are where the most important people sit. If you remember the story of Abraham Lincoln when he was shot in the Ford Theater while sitting in his box seat, these are the seats where important people like the president, very wealthy people would sit to watch shows, literally right on the stage. So they would be right up front, right on the stage with the actors and actresses. So these are the box seats, and those are important to the story of the Phantom of the Opera a little bit later on too. And here you see a little bit of the famous chandelier, which actually did fall in the Opera House, and is part of the story of the Phantom of the Opera. This is a drawing of the Opera House inside, so you can see what this gigantic chandelier looks like. The chandelier weighed 11 tons, so about 22,000 pounds. Pretty impressive, pretty big. Here's another view of the balconies around the outside. So it's a very tall building. But the performance area, this theater, this auditorium where they performed in, was actually a small part of the Opera House. So this is a cutaway view of the Opera House where we can see what it looks like cut right down through the middle. I'll open up another screen here so you can see this picture a little bit better. Let me try. Let me try this one. So I'll see if I can zoom in on this picture a little better. So the Opera House, when it was built on a lake. And the most of Paris is covered with water everywhere. And unlike here in the United States, where all of our roads are actual roads that cars drive upon, in Paris, I'll switch over here to some of the waterways in Paris. A lot of the streets in Paris are actual waterways. There's a main river that runs down through the town, but then there are also waterways that run all the way through the city so that they come right up next to some of the buildings throughout the town. And people get around on these little gondola boats that look like this. You've probably seen pictures of these before, where gondoliers would push the boats through these waterways, and the water would come right up to the front of the buildings. Here's a good picture down here where you see how the water comes right up to the edge of the buildings, and the boats would pull up to the edge of the buildings. A lot of them actually even had the water go underneath the building, so you would park your boat under the building instead of parking it in a garage, and you would pull right up to the doors. So this would be an entrance right into a building. So this is the way a lot of Paris is, and because of that, the Paris Opera House was built on water. And so they pumped all the water out of this area underneath the Opera House, built the Opera House, and then they allowed the water to flood back in. And so this area all underneath the Opera House is actually a lake. And you see how big this building is. That giant staircase that goes up through the beginning of the theater is right here. This is that main entranceway that we saw with all the beautiful pictures and paintings and gold all over it. And then this is the grand staircase that led up to this level that brought you into the theater. This is where the audience sits. This is all those balconies that are in there. This is the chandelier tube, where the chandelier could be raised up into this tube so it could be cleaned and then drop back down into the theater. And then this is the main stage. And then these were all what's called the fly space that were used to raise and lower all the scenery. And then backstage were multiple levels of dressing rooms. This is where all the actors and actresses were behind the stage. Down below, this is where all the storage was for the props and sets and scenery and things like that. There was storage all the way down underneath the building, as you can see here. Then behind the stage, this was called the Divas Room. This gigantic room, you look at how big this is compared to the whole theater. This is where the star was. This was her dressing room. It was only for her. Everybody else shared these little tiny compartments, and this was the Divas Room. So this is where Carlotta was in this giant room. And then behind this were the dormitories. This is where all the girls who danced in the ballet lived, and all the people who worked at the Opera House lived back here in what were called the dormitories. This was a stable where they could bring in horses and buggies from out on the main street, and they would keep them in this stable back here. But the thing that was really key to the Opera House was back during this time period, the rich people came to the Opera House and ran the Opera House, and they did not want all their other rich friends to see all the servants and the people who worked in the Opera House. So very typical of this time period, and a lot of houses in the United States were even like this back in the mid-1800s. All the walls were hollow. So you can't really see it in this picture, because this picture would have to be huge in order to be able to see that much detail. But there were secret trap doors all the way through every level of the Opera House, all over the place, so that the servants could get in and out of the rooms, and then they would travel through the walls. They would actually walk through the inside of the walls, which would be 2 or 3 feet wide, and go from one secret door to another secret door to get into the places where the rich people would reside. But that way they weren't seen in the hallways. So if they were traveling around through the halls and there were a lot of rich people out in the hallways, they wouldn't see that the servants were bringing food from one room to another, or going from one room to another to clean. So the Phantom, the story of the Phantom is that the Phantom lived in the walls. He lived down here in the catacombs, the lower part of the Opera House where the lake was, and he traveled through the walls and through all the different levels of the Opera House to get to everywhere that he needed to go. He could go anywhere in the entire building. Now, to add to the story of the Phantom, people would go down into this lower level to retrieve pieces of sets and props, and they would never come back. Well, the reason that would happen, if they went down into these very lower levels, it was very wet and damp down there, and the surfaces were very slippery, and people would slip and fall into the water, and they would drown and never return. And so the stories of the Phantom living down here and killing everyone who came down from the Upper Opera House started to spread. And yes, there were people that actually did die down in the bottom of the Opera House because they would slip and fall due to an accident, not due to the Phantom. And so that helped add to the stories of the Phantom of the Opera. The other thing that added to it was during the Franco-Prussian War, the Opera House was used as a munitions storage, where they would store all the bullets for the guns and all the rockets and missiles and grenades and anything else they would use in the battle. But they also used it as a prisoners storage. They would keep prisoners down here in the lower levels of the Opera House in what were known as the catacombs. And there were a lot of buildings throughout Paris that had these, what are known as the catacombs, that are all connected together by the lakes that are underneath the buildings. And so the people who were running this part of the prisoners' place in the Opera House were killed in the war, and no one knew that there were prisoners down here. And there were hundreds of prisoners who died down here in the Opera House. There were thousands of prisoners that died throughout Paris in these catacombs. And so the catacombs were made to pay honor to all those people that died. And so this is what the actual walls of the catacombs underneath the buildings in Paris look like. They took all the skulls of all the prisoners who died, and these are all their leg and arm bones, and they actually built memorials in the walls to all of these people who died down in the catacombs. So this helped fuel the story of the Phantom of the Opera too, with all of this stuff taking place down in these catacombs. There were actually walls. There are actually walls in the Paris Opera House that look like this. Okay, and you'll see some of these images as the movie goes on. You'll see them traveling through the lake underneath the Opera House. So the story of the Phantom was that his face was deformed, and there are a lot of different versions of the story. This is the face that is in the musical version of the Phantom of the Opera. If you go see it on Broadway, this is the version you're going to see in the movie that we're going to watch. This was a silent movie version of the Phantom of the Opera back in the 1920s. Again, here is the view of the Phantom from the opera. So the story was that the Phantom had some kind of disease that was eating the skin away on his face, and you could actually see through his skull into his brain. There were stories that his nose wasn't actually there, but in most of them, his nose is there. It was a little more pronounced in different versions of the story. And then there are different masks that were involved too. This is the mask that is used in the movie that we're going to watch, the half face mask that would just cover up this side of his face. There's some versions where it goes a little further down. There are some full face masks like this one. This was another one that was done in a mini-series version of the Phantom of the Opera where it covered everything except his mouth. Again, this is one of the versions of the Phantom where, yes, his nose was actually gone, and so that would require a full face mask. So there were a lot of different stories and versions of the Phantom that developed over the years, and so this is the one that we're going to be seeing and talking about. So, and these are some of the different masks that you can see. Most of them are in white. That's the most popular version of the mask. There are some that are in black, and this is obviously a more contemporary mask, but there are a lot of different versions of it. There are a lot of versions of what was known as the masquerade mask that the Phantom wore. So it's a very interesting story. It's an amazing tale. There are a lot of different characters that you're going to see involved in the story. If you actually want to read the book is by a guy by the name of Gaston Leroux. He was a French journalist, and he wrote the original novel. It's a very good book if you like to read. It's a little different than the movie version because they had to change some things for the movie to work out a little bit better. And the order of the movie is a little bit different than the order of the original book, but the basic story still remains the same. Okay, so if you want to, go look at a lot of this other stuff before we start watching the movie. Again, you can go look at a cutaway of the Paris Opera House. You can go look at Phantom masks. You can go look at Phantom faces. You can go look at the Paris waterways, the Paris gondolas, where you see all these different boats that are in Paris. the catacombs that are down underneath all throughout Paris, and the opera house itself, and take a look at those things that are there, and then we will actually start watching the movie version. Now, the movie version is based on the musical that was written by Andrew Lloyd Webber. So Andrew Lloyd Webber took the book that was written by Gaston Leroux and wrote music to various different scenes and various different situations that happen throughout the show. He wrote it very much like an opera, where almost everything is sung, and there are sections of it that are sung as an opera. We'll talk about those when we actually get into it. And there are parts that are done as a musical where there is some regular talking in between. The musical version is obviously all done on a stage, so they give the illusion of being on the water in a boat. They give you the illusion of traveling from one place to another. In the movie version we're going to watch, they actually go to those places, because in a movie you can actually film riding on a horse and traveling in a car and going to an actual cemetery instead of trying to create the illusion of it on stage. Okay? So thanks for hanging with me today. I will prepare the first version of the video, and like I said, I'll have it out on Wednesday or Thursday, so just watch for that to be released. I'll send you guys an email and a notification about it, and we'll go from there. And again, take some time if you want on your own. You don't have to, but if you want to go look at a lot of these other pictures of the chandelier and the grand staircase and all the different things that are there, and read about some of the stuff with the opera house, go ahead and do that on your own. And then we'll start watching the movie together later this week. Okay? Have a good day.